All right, folks, I think it's, it's a 12:01. I think we can probably get started. Welcome to everyone attending. This is a training session for the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, specifically on tax relief for housing through RSA 79E. I'm June McCartan. I'm an urban planner with a consulting firm called Outwith Studio. And I, along with many staff from the RPCs, put together the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, and I'll be conducting the session today. So maybe we've got a lot of people in our presenter crew today, so maybe we'll do a quick round of introductions, and I'll start by passing it over to Darren.
Good afternoon. My name is Darren Winham. I'm the Economic Development Director for the Town of Exeter, and we've done, I think, to date, probably 4 79Es.
Awesome. And Tony?
Yeah, I'm Tony Calandrello. I'm the owner of a restaurant and wine bar called Vino e Vivo in Exeter. Work with Darren, and we're one of the 4 79Es.
Awesome. And then Matt.
Matt Monahan, Central New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission. I have 20 towns I work with. One of my towns, Allenstown, actually has a 79E example regarding housing in the slideshow.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So just logistics for today to folks who are here. We're going to start with the presentation and then move into a Q&A. During that Q&A, you can raise your hand via the Teams software toolbar. It's a little hand icon, and that will alert us, and we can turn your mic on if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, either during the Q&A or before doing the presentation, feel free to drop questions or comments into the chat, which you can, again, access through that toolbar. It's like a little speech bubble looking icon. Great. So just a little bit about the toolbox. The New Hampshire Housing Toolbox is a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. It lives as kind of 2 forms that you can access via nhhousingtoolbox.org. The first is a just a PDF booklet version of the toolbox that contains all the tools. And then there's a website version, again, at nhhousingtoolbox.org. You can sort of browse it interactively and also like send individual tools are like linkable through their URLs. The toolbox is part of the wider statewide regional housing needs assessment process that was conducted sort of in a coordinated fashion by the RPCs, the regional planning commissions. It was funded through the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, sort of federal funds passing through the state. The toolbox process and content development and everything was led by a subcommittee of staff, mostly from RPCs, but then also New Hampshire Housing, and was facilitated by the state's Office of Planning and Development. There was a consultant team, so Outwith Studio, the firm I'm from, we helped with planning, content, and visual identity, and then a firm called Boku did web design and development. The toolbox, again, is this 20 planning and zoning tools. For each tool, we try to answer these questions. What is it? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? What does implementation look like? And where can you learn more? So pointing you to resources outside of the toolbox context. It's meant for people working in and around local government. So we sort of broadly define that. That's like, of course, local government staff, people on planning staff or related departments. But then, of course, like planning board members, select board members, legislative body members, et cetera. And then even local advocates, folks who are active in their community, interested in housing. And as for all these folks, it's meant to save time on upfront research. So we're providing sort of a high level overview of each of these things and a framework for sort of understanding how, like which tools might be best for you and your community, and then pointing you towards, resources where you can learn more. It's sort of a standardized format, which you'll get a preview of today. What is it? How can it help? Getting started, which is like implementation, considerations, resources, which is just a basket of links to other resources from around the state. Issues addressed, which I'll touch on in a minute. related tools, which are other tools in the toolbox, which either serve the same function or can kind of be stacked on one another. State law, so where there's relevant state legal references, and then case studies for communities in New Hampshire and beyond. So in New England and even farther afield. We're really, we use this field called issues addressed as a way to help narrow down the list of 20 planning and zoning strategies for you as you go through it. So it's housing options, is like, different types of housing, maybe not conventional single family development, not large apartment types, just a wider range of housing options. Housing costs, so here we mean like broad market rate affordability. So can your typical household go and purchase or rent a market rate home at a reasonable cost? Affordable housing, by which we mean deed restricted affordable housing, like deed restricted units that qualify under state workforce housing rules, that must be rented or sold to income eligible households at a affordable rate. Sustainable housing, so how to make housing that's less resource and land consumptive. Specifically multi-generational options, so for households and household structures that don't fit neatly into the conventional single family model, what are housing options that meet their needs? Infrastructure, so this is where communities maybe don't have infrastructure to support development. How do you either locate housing in places where there is infrastructure, or how do you get more and more adequate infrastructure in your community? And then redevelopment, specific strategies that target like redevelopment of underutilized or vacant parcels or buildings, one of which we'll touch on today. And then before I jump in, I really want to highlight here that we're talking about housing production in this toolbox. Like, that's the focus. There's a lot of topics that these tools can cover, things like sustainability, things like equity and whatnot. There's also a multitude of housing related topics that you could pursue, like housing's a big topic with a lot of sub branches within it, but we're really specifically focused on housing and housing production. So how do we actually use these tools to build more homes? So we're going to be talking about two flavors of the same kind of legal framework today. That's RSA 79E, and it's been around for a little while, and in its sort of like base form, the sort of like vanilla flavor, it's the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive Program, and that's programs that are adopted and implemented locally, and I'll sort of get into the details of that. We'll also be discussing something called housing opportunity zones, which is like a new addition to the law, which provides more opportunity and flexibility to local government. So the Community Revitalization Tax Relief Incentive, and it's a state-enabled, locally implemented relief program, and it's relief for property owners from increased taxes resulting from redevelopment in a downtown or village area. So say a community has adopted this program, RSA 79E, and we'll get into what that entails in a second. But let's say the community's adopted that. A landowner has a piece of land. They want to redevelop it or rehabilitate it in some way in this downtown or village area. They can apply for this tax relief program that reduces their tax burden to what it was before the redevelopment. So any incremental increase in taxes that would have occurred due to that rehabilitation, would not be incurred, and it'd be for a period of a number of years. And so the sort of every communities implement this differently. There's some guidelines in RSA 79E about how the length of time that there is tax relief, how it can be administered, but we sort of see it as 5 years and up. Sort of it's a range of say like 2 to maybe like 13 years. So there's rules for rehabilitating historic structures, rules for producing market rate housing, rules for producing affordable, that would be workforce housing. So again, the implementations kind of vary from community to community, and we'll go into a little more detail about Exeter's implementation in a little bit. But okay, so you have this tax relief program, that's awarded to landowners and developers on a project-by-project basis. And so the community adopts the program, the landowner developer applies, and then there's a process of approval by the local governing body. And again, this is in a sort of prescribed downtown or village area, and would only apply to properties within that area. So a little more on like what projects you could use this for. Again, there has to be local adoption of RSA 79E and designation of a downtown or village area in the community. It has to be a project in that designated area. And the proposed rehabilitation costs need to be at least 15% of the building's pre-rehab assessed value, or $75,000, whichever is less. And then the rehabilitation needs to be consistent with the municipality's master plan or development regulations. It can't be, adverse to what the community is looking to do. This can help in a number of ways. So you see it a lot for historic preservation efforts. So like old mills, we'll talk about an example in a little bit. Old municipal buildings, other institutional buildings, just older commercial buildings. These buildings that have significant historical value, but have been, become more decrepit or have been underutilized or otherwise fallen into disrepair. This can be a tool to help a landowner or developer preserve that structure in a way that's consistent with the community's wishes. Economic development, so this can certainly apply to underutilized properties or land in, say, a village area that was maybe once booming, but is now, maybe fallen on tougher times, or seen vacancies, or just doesn't have the kind of economic vitality that the community wants. It encourages infill development and investment where infrastructure already exists. So touching on that piece of like, if there's demand for housing, it's looking for an outlet somewhere. It's, better for the local government and a lot of other stakeholders if that development happens where infrastructure already exists. So the corollary to that is it reduces demand for greenfield development, which can be more resource intensive and imply greater costs to the community at large. It addresses deterioration and vacancy. It provides a mechanism to ensure contextually sensitive development. So, because the town is offering this tax relief, there's sort of more of a role for the town to make sure it's contextually sensitive. It can provide amenities for surrounding neighborhoods. That's another sort of thing that the community can ask for. Energy conservation, and then the incentive is really useful in a lot of communities because it provides this incentive without upfront costs. Like it's a subsidy to make a project work that the town isn't paying out of pocket for up front, which it might otherwise, have to or want to or whatever. So this implies no upfront costs to the town or city. It because the mechanism, it reduces the increase on taxes for a specified period of time, but it's not actually costing current tax revenue. It's sort of level funding the taxes from that parcel, if that sort of metaphor makes sense. And then this is something that maybe Matt can speak to a little more. We talk about all of that long list of potential benefits, but it really sort of breaks down in sort of two ways. So maybe Matt, if you can jump in here.
Yeah, so I think when 79E comes up, there's a lot of different thoughts, right? Like, what's the developer getting? How do we do the benefits? Like, how do we, how many years do we put in place and those kinds of things? But I think this is really the key here, right? Think about it just, from the town's perspective. Yes, the applicant's going to get a benefit, but what is the town or city going to get? And really, these are kind of the two levers to think about. One of them is you may have a project that's close to being viable. And then this is just enough of a nudge to kind of make it a reality. But the other way is the one on the bottom there is where you can kind of drive the redevelopment or infill of those areas in the downtown, specific to what the community wants, right? You have some control over what happens in your community on a given tract of land by using 79E, right? I think if you just focus on those two, you'll be able to kind of see when you look at an application, this is the step back and look at it and say, okay, this is what we're doing, either this or that, right? It's either pushing them over the edge to make it happen or steering towards what the town or city wants.
I think it's just it's a very useful framework for understanding like what a community sort of gets out of a tool like this. So like, how do you actually go about doing this? So first, you want to connect the existing master plan goals or an ongoing master plan process to this 79E tool. So if you have specific goals around mixed use or housing development in a downtown or village area, like increasing residents there, that would be a sort of goal that would connect back to this 79E tool. Similarly, like economic development, economic vitality would also qualify, and also sort of nudging development towards places where there's existing infrastructure would also be part of that. So if there's a master plan process going on, obviously you want to like specify like, here's the goal. One way we're going to do this is through 79E. Part of that process, either part of like that master plan process or as a separate standalone question, you want to conduct a community engagement process that establishes a vision for the downtown or village area and the desired types of development for specific sites. So you want to go into this adoption process and opening up this tool, knowing really what the community is looking for, so you can tailor your tool to meet those needs. Part of that too is understanding what areas of town should count as this downtown or village area. That's a very like loose term. I think under RSA 79E, it can sort of default back to a downtown or village area specified in a master plan. It can also default back to existing zoning districts if they sort of, the purpose of those districts is to be a downtown or village area zoning district. But then there's also still flexibility in the tool. You can designate a separate downtown or village area, that would have to like qualify as such. It can't be, it'd have to be a reasonable downtown or village area, but it doesn't need to be tied back specifically to your master plan or your existing zoning if you don't want it to be. You can also designate a set of a downtown or village area as literally the eligible area within the downtown. So Exeter's example is a good one of that, where there's like sort of multiple nodes that qualify under their 79E program, and it shows the different ways it can be used. All right, so you have your vision and designation, or understood areas, your downtown and village area. You've connected it back to the goals. Now you need to draft the legislation to adopt 79E locally. And here again, if you haven't designated a downtown or village area already, you could do it as part of that legislation. So from like the legislative body's perspective, this is sort of all they need to do is sort of adopt 79E and make sure that downtown or village area is designated. From there, the town or city would need to develop application materials and a process for property owners to apply for the 79E program. And, you know, ultimately that would go before the governing body, who would either approve or deny it, or approve with conditions, whatever. One thing that I think can be set up in this process, but could also be done through the adoption legislation, is specifying what the rules around length of the tax relief, like how long a property owner gets that tax relief, and sort of what's the stack of years of tax relief they would get for specific community benefits. All right, so you have that process set up. There's application forms. There's like a system for, you know, taking in the application and moving it through to the governing body. Then it's time to do outreach and actually get folks to understand that this is an option available. And this would be relevant for, you know, property owners. It would also be relevant for developers working in the area who might be doing development that's similar to the kind you want. So even if they don't own land in your downtown, just like make it known that this is a thing. After the adoption, there's a process for the private applications. This is a fun kind of complex diagram from CDFA that sort of shows the steps that need to happen. And sort of each community would have their kind of own local implementation of this. But, you know, this is all to say that, like, once you adopt it, it's not like suddenly it's a free-for-all. There's a process that it goes through, and each project will be uniquely reviewed through this process. And it's sort of, you're not opening the gates, you're just giving yourself another tool if you adopt it. So things to consider is the trade-off, of course, between redevelopment versus immediate tax revenue increases. So if a project happened to be viable and they like won this this tax relief, then in theory that's a loss on increased tax revenue to the local government. So, you know, that's what can sometimes make 79E controversial, and I'm sure Darren will talk about some measure of controversy that's occurred around projects in Exeter. With that in mind, you want to calibrate your program to the specific real estate financial analysis that would be relevant to your site. So, like, ideal world, you are able to conduct a real estate financial analysis or get technical assistance to do so, to figure out what in dollar terms, what's this tax relief actually mean, and you know, how many years is the minimum number of years you need in order to make sure you're calibrating it right. Engagement should really be used to educate the public about what this is, because again, it's going to become a process, and so there's chances for misinformation. There's like chances for just misunderstanding. So engagement should really focus in, like, what are the mechanics of this? What can we use it for? What are the goals, etc. Local project eligibility criteria can be made more strict. The sort of 79E sets a floor, but the community can design sort of their own implementation of it if it's, you know, meets the qualifications of that floor. And then there is some interaction with sort of local historic districts and historic commissions, and in the absence of those, other local or state bodies, to show that if you're fully replacing a building in this sort of downtown or village area, that you're not like tearing down a structure of significance. So that there is some beyond just really the governing body, there is this role for other local bodies to sort of like weigh in on the nature of what's happening, and just you need to be able to coordinate that in your local process. And then if they are National or State Register of Historic Places properties, they can be eligible for 79E relief outside of that downtown or village area. So that's just something to keep in mind if you have like institutional buildings or mills or whatever outside of your area. If they already have this designation, even if they are in the downtown, they can be eligible for relief. Okay, so quickly just moving into housing opportunity zones. This should run a little bit faster here. So housing opportunity zone is a new part of 79E. It's 79E 4C. And instead of targeting redevelopment projects in downtowns, which can include housing and often are structured to encourage housing, a housing opportunity zone is specifically structured to encourage housing generally in community specified areas. So it doesn't need to be a downtown or village area. It could be sort of, you know, I think of the examples of underutilized office parks or dead malls, even strip retail areas, places where people are often now talking about housing going, even if they aren't in a downtown or village area, they could become a housing opportunity zone to qualify for housing related tax relief. And then so a project within a designated housing opportunity zone, wherever it is, 30% of the homes in a project must be deed restricted affordable housing and meet some other criteria, which I'll get into in a second. And then they could be eligible for up to 10 years of tax relief. So it's a pretty, that's the sort of max that RSA 79E sets, and the community can kind of decide within that 10-year threshold how much they want to deliver. And it's structured sort of the same way as 79E. It's there's the tax value on property taxes before development, and that stays level even after the development is built. It's just relief from that taxes on the new value generated by housing development. So projects need to be, you know, the community has to have adopted 79E 4C and designated a housing opportunity zone. So there needs to be this local legislation that does that. And then the project needs to have 30% of their homes within that need to be affordable to households earning 80% of less of AMI, area median income, which is a HUD designated threshold. There's also a more complicated set of eligible thresholds of sort of affordability and how many units you need. That's based on the New Hampshire Affordable Housing Fund. So it's sort of either that blanket 30% at 80%, 30% of units at 80% AMI, or could be 50% at, you know, like a 30% AMI, or like some other mix of affordability thresholds. It can help because it encourages new housing development. Of course, that's sort of why it's in this production-focused toolbox. And then specifically can help with production of housing for low-income households, which in general are not going to be served well by new development. That's just sort of general rule of housing market in the US. So that unless it's mandated as affordable housing, it's probably not going to be serving low-income households. So this is a way to get new development that does that. Targeted economic development, again, if you have something like a dead mall or sort of an underutilized strip area, this is a tool to revitalize those. And similarly, it's incentives without direct upfront costs. It sort of costs the town nothing at the time that it's awarded. And then it's another subsidy tool for affordable development. So affordable developments are very expensive to build. They usually require a wild stack of government subsidies. And again, this is just another tool that a community can use to layer onto that stack to make affordable development that much more viable in this constrained environment. Adoption and implementation is very similar, connected to the master plan. Have your community engagement process to sort of determine where might be appropriate for a housing opportunity zone and a vision for those areas, what the mechanics of the program should, might look like. Adopt it locally, designate the HOZ boundaries, and then set up the process and promote it to landowners. So otherwise very similar to vanilla 79E. Trade-offs, you've either got new mixed income housing versus immediate increase of local tax revenue. Presumably, most of these projects would be viable as market rate housing developments without this tax relief, and this tax relief is really ensuring that they have this sort of mixed income quality to them. Mileage may vary depending on the real estate economics of your community, but sort of that's the sort of trade-off that gets set up. You again want to think about how this tool might interact with other local tools like inclusionary zoning if you've adopted that, or the financial tools associated with affordable housing development, things like the low-income housing tax credit. If you can do that real estate financial analysis to make sure it's all in the ballpark of making sense economically. In hot markets, this is a broad sweeping generalization, but in hot markets, housing opportunity zones might not be necessary to produce mixed income housing. Like inclusionary zoning might be a sort of preferable tool. Again, do the real estate financial analysis, consider that trade-off, educate yourself on how it would work in your community. Like any affordable housing, you need administrative capacity to make sure the deed restrictions are getting stuck to, and that's a huge burden that gets placed on communities. And so you can look to partners to how to best do that. And then just note, the tax relief is up to 10 years at the governing body's discretion, and it begins at the issuance of a CO, so a certificate of occupancy. That's when the clock starts ticking. Quickly running through some case studies before I hand it off to the Exeter folks to get into some more detail about their law and process. So China Mill in Allenstown, maybe Matt was involved in this process, so maybe you can speak to this.
Yeah, so China Mill, it's a mill down, if you're familiar with Suncook, it's a village shared by Pembroke and Allenstown. At the bottom, so to speak, of it, near the Merrimack River, there was a large mill down there that kind of was declining. They had a developer come in to do, I think it's like about 150 units of rental housing. And they did use 79E to support this project, and they got a 7-year delay on the increase in taxes through that. What's interesting about this is as the project was coming forward, the town already had an infill zone zoning ordinance set up, like an overlay district. So what they did is they had to change it to deal with something so big, right? A lot of it was focused on more smaller lots, smaller type development. So they actually worked with the developer to say, hey, what are you guys looking to do? So in that process, they rewrote their infill zone overlay district to accommodate this. And while they were doing that, they also said in like the preamble of that article, this is also our 79E district. So it overlapped quite nicely, and they were able to use this to help this project move along. I think it's 1 bedroom, if I remember right. There's 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and a few 3 bedroom apartments, and it's like I said, it's about 150 units altogether.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, that's I think the scale of it makes and the sort of housing focus of it make it a sort of standout project of the 79Es. I should say all of these examples are vanilla 79E examples. None of them are housing opportunity zones because the housing opportunity zone was passed in 2021 session, and so no communities have yet adopted it. So I think folks are feeling it out. There's like a lot of discussion happening, but no one's actually adopted it yet. So these are all Community Revitalization Tax Relief. This is another example. This is from Dover, where this is an old county courthouse, sort of no longer used for that purpose, and it's sort of being rehabilitated to be housing, and then it's sort of a rehabilitation and addition. So this would be in a complicated process. This is a historic structure. It would have to go through the review with the governing body, but then also the historic commission. But it's in the end, 79E was like part of a stack that actually made this project happen successfully. And then I include this here. We're about to talk to Exeter, but this is an example we include in the toolbox, and it's this one does not involve housing. This is a sort of restaurant redevelopment. But again, I think it's even if this isn't housing specifically, it's sort of relevant to the project in that it's sort of opportunistic move by a developer who wasn't, or a company in fact, who wasn't like already active in the area, and sort of this was became a tool for them to move into this area of Exeter and sort of do some economic revitalization. So not housing specific, but an interesting case study nonetheless. And with that, we'll pass it over to Exeter to talk a little bit about their process and sort of their experience with the tool.
Sure. I'll just say that, oh, am I still muted?
You're good.
Oh, good. I'm not. Sorry, I'm having a little computer trouble here. I see my battery's dying. Yeah, so Exeter is an SB2 town. And so when we want to do any changing, we want to change zoning or do anything like that, we have to go to the public. And so a lot of staff members, including myself, are basically salesmen that time of year, because if we want to get something passed, we go out to Riverwoods, assisted living facility, where a lot of voters come. We hold public meetings, and that's what they did here. I started here in 2014, and they adopted this, and then they in 2014, I started later on, they said, okay, let's get somebody to try to implement this. And that CDOG example is a really big deal because that changed our community greatly. The property is owned by a developer named Steve Canham. He's also a resident. And so he was looking to develop it. It was a kind of a rundown building right on the edge of the water. First thing you see when you get down to our downtown coming in that direction. And Exeter at the time was basically a town that would roll up their streets at 5 o'clock. We didn't have a very, our demographic was definitely older in terms of what stores people were going to. When CDOG came in, it literally changed the town. A lot of other developers started looking at it. Our demographics changed. People 20s and 30 somethings actually go to our restaurants now as opposed to going to Portsmouth and Hampton. So the way we pulled this deal off is Steve Canham was looking to build this out, and he wasn't looking at 79E at first. But then when CDOG started looking at the coastal area, it came down to us, Exeter, Amesbury, and Newburyport. And we were able to land them, and a lot of that was done because the work that was being done on that building had to completely change because it was going to be housing and a little retail downstairs. But now there is one housing unit in it, and they have the CDOG actually rents that out too for employees. But they took the whole building. They don't own it. Steve Canham does still own it. So the way we did it was they brought this thing forward, the enabling legislation. Exeter adopted it as is, the RSA as is. We've done several and successful 79Es, which I'll flip to Tony in just a second. We did the one at Vivo, which is interesting because it wasn't a whole building. It was he has a condo unit in a downtown building. But you had mentioned a little bit of controversy, and that's kind of where we're getting to now, because Exeter has been, according to 3 residents that are outspoken, too generous. And I think they're probably right. We've given a 9-year to the CDOG, and I think 3 7 years. And so I think when we're looking at this now, we're looking at it as, okay, well, when do the people really need this money? When do they really need the support? And we're finding that is more upfront the first couple of years. And we want to be really more housing focused. And so what we're looking at, there's a few staff members and myself, and there's a committee, Housing Advisory Committee, that is looking at this as well. The edict has come down from the select board. Hey, this tool has been really great for us. Let's see if we can't modify it, make it a little less time and more targeted. That's what we're working on now. And I think we've come up with something pretty special. Because when you get to the map and you see, okay, perfect. So where we've done it is right along Water Street. All the buildings we've done have been in the WC district, the Waterfront Commercial District. But we definitely need to see improvements in the C1 area, particularly along the train station. And this is a tool that we want to we want to really use, just like we use it on Water Street, to encourage investment. We have a lot of interest, and that's where we're going with it. And last thing I'll say is, in this process, in looking at this process and going from just having it adopted and have it available for as many years as one can get, what we realize, at least I do anyway, is that when towns look at this now, I hope they will watch this presentation and use the toolbox, because I think all towns should really look at it as a customizable tool instead of just adopting it willy-nilly. I think you can really just sort of drive development, like Matt was saying, by doing that, by implementing what you want per the master plan. So, and I'll just pass it over to Tony if he wants to talk about what how he's used it.
Sure. Thank you, Darren. Yeah, my name is Tony Calandrello. I'm the owner of Vino e Vivo. And as Darren mentioned, we were one of the applicants early on. Our project began considering it in 2017. We actually went before the select board in the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And as Darren mentioned, it was a little bit of a wrinkle for them because, first of all, we were the second application in, and also we were one unit of a larger building. The building was built in 1873. It's part of the waterfront commercial district, historic building. But there was some discussion back and forth, and the select board ultimately decided that a single unit, that 79E, should apply to that. We received approval at the end of January 2018 and began work almost immediately after that. And the value to this project was twofold. One was anticipated, in that we had the immediate benefit of contributing to the viability of the project, but it became invaluable during COVID because we, like many other restaurants, were hit pretty hard. And having this in place, again, it was never anticipated, was really something that contributed to us being able to survive loss of revenue during COVID years. And I'll just talk briefly about the economic impact. I know it's not a housing project, but economic impact is real, and it is of benefit to town and contributes to the quality of life and the attractability or attractiveness of a community to new residents. And that is, whereas our facility or our location had been a clothing consignment shop with one employee on a part-time basis. You can see the before picture on the left. This is after all the clothes are out of there. And we now have 11 employees, full and part-time. You can see what the location looks like now that we've done the rehabbing of it. And at a state level, we contribute about $60,000 a year in meals and rental tax to the state. So there's a true economic impact of that. And then there's the intangible of us bringing life to a section of town that really wasn't vital after hours. At 5 o'clock, shopkeepers would have their keys in the door and leaving. And now it's become really an attractive destination at the after hours, and has attracted a few other folks who now are starting businesses after hour. So with that, unless there's any questions, I'll turn it back to you, June.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, one thing I find really interesting about there's a couple things. First, let's just say I think the size component is really interesting, and the condoized nature of it. So, I think with a lot of these tools, we tend to think more on a China mill scale, where it's 150 units, multi-million-dollar project, and but I think your story shows how this could be used, whether for business or for housing, as like a tool at a much smaller scale. And when we think about a lot of our smaller village areas, I think it shows how successful it can be. The other thing I just want to turn to is maybe the application. This is probably a little bit hard for folks to read, but just noting here that like this is Tony's application, where there's a form set up by the town of Exeter, and there's like the normal details about where the project is, but then it goes into detail of like, all right, well, how do you meet the specific objectives that our local law states we want to happen? And so there's like 4 objectives listed. I think those are directly lifted from 79E.
Yes.
But like Tony had to go through and write exactly how the project would be fulfilling each one of these 4 objectives, or whichever of the 4 he thought it would fulfill. And then also here, this 3rd page, which is an actual listing of like rehabilitation costs. And so I imagine, Tony, you probably like got this costed with a contractor and were able to say like, this is how much I'm putting in, or we anticipate to put in. You know, this will be like, this is how the tax relief would make this project viable.
Right, right. Well, one other thing I'd add, June, and Darren can talk maybe more about it, but it does not keep you from going through if there's a revaluation, for example, in a town, that your taxable amount can increase due to any revaluation.
The base, yeah.
Right.
In Exeter, what we do is the process is someone will get a hold of me and we'll discuss it. I'll try to determine whether I think that they qualify or not. If it's obvious that they do, or not obvious that they do, if it looks like they might, we have them fill this application out, and then I write a memo to the board as we go in front of the select board. I put in that memo, I put as an example, the historic districts. Tony was in a historic district. I had some paperwork on that. We put that in there. We put the actual RSA in there. We put the application, of course, goes in there. Any photos, we have them. Some applications, some projects are so large they can't use that 3rd page, and they have to create their own, basically a pro forma they're putting out there, everything that they're going to do. And then the board determines what they want. Now, it's an interesting situation if you look at the RSA, because they don't have to answer right away. They can say, oh, well, I think they have 30 or 40 days, but Exeter does it on the spot. We always do it, at least the ones we've done so far. The select board has got to a yes. There's always this lively discussion about how long we should let this go. And so that's obviously changing in this town now, but people should just know that just because you fill one out, the board can really determine, okay, well, Tony, 3 of these benefits, we're not so sure that really meets it. So we're going to give you, we think a couple years is more fair instead of 7, which he did get. So the board has a lot of control in that regard, which is an excellent thing, because as we all know, there's very few economic development tools in New Hampshire, and this is one of them. And it's a darn good one. So I always would certainly encourage any community to do it. And if you don't want to go big at first, just keep it. And if your residents are concerned, just keep it light. Don't just go a couple years, 3 years or something. So we've certainly got our bang for the buck out of it.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions. Let me see it. I don't see any questions in the chat quite yet, but if folks have any questions on either 79E generally, the Housing Opportunity Zone, any of the case studies, Allenstown, or any of the Exeter stuff. See, from Gabby, we say, who in New Hampshire is doing the real estate financial analysis? Any people smaller towns can turn to for help? And is it straightforward for a developer to understand the total tax relief they may get so they can include it in a pro forma? Maybe folks who are more active in these towns. Matt, do you know of anyone doing this financial?
I don't. I mean, I think Tony's example where he had his contractor, walk through some of the costs and things like that. I think that's probably the best way to get that filled out. And then maybe on the town side, I don't know if you guys did this, Darren, but if you want to have somebody check in on that from your perspective, maybe have the building inspector. I mean, they're right there. That's kind of their zone, right? The building inspector. And you can always probably reach out if you're really stumped. Maybe the town's engineer could be a good place to go to double check some of those costs. But yeah, I think that could be a way to handle it.
The assessor as well. The assessor,
yeah.
and that's what happens.
Yeah, don't forget them.
When the one does apply, because if they get it, then the assessor has to go in. If they get approved, the assessor goes in and makes an assessment then. And the second part of that question was, as a person's doing their pro forma, we have had, in one instance at least, maybe even 2, they couldn't anticipate the years, but they were pretty confident they qualified, and they discussed this with their bank. They're like, we think we're going to be able to get some relief, and we can wrap that in the pro forma after we go forward and see if we do get and what we get. So yeah, there's definitely forethought in that regard. And I see we have Noah.
Yeah, we have another, more just to kind of take over the questions here. We have another question from Stephanie H. How does this tool with energy conservation?
I'm not sure it interacts with that.
Yeah.
It could be a benefit though, if for instance, someone wants to do some sort of green or energy, however, they can a town can say that's one of the conditions. You know, if you do something that'll be considered a public benefit, they can wrap that into that as they adopt it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it may,
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was gonna say, and it may not necessarily conflict with energy conservation either, right? As Darren's saying, you know, you could use it as one of the conditions, but I don't think there could be a conflict with it either. Yeah.
All right, we got another question here from Robert. Does it apply only to existing buildings? What about infill? If it does apply to infill in a parking lot, for example, would the taxes be frozen at the tax rate on the parking lot? What about rehab of a former government building like the courthouse that wasn't on the tax rolls?
So it can apply to infill, like it would, either on a parking lot or like a vacant lot situation or a replacement of an existing structure. All of those would be fair game. And yes, the taxes would be frozen at that tax rate for the parking lot or what have you for however many years you specify in the town. And then the courthouse one is an interesting example. I'm sure we could look to Dover to get a specific answer on how that one was handled. But
it looks like it was a private developer that bought it, right?
Yes, yeah. And I imagine that it would be frozen at, it's calculated on the assessed value is my guess at how they handled that. So even if it's an exempt building, there's still an assessed value for that real estate. And so the taxes would be calculated on that assessed value. I don't think the private developer would carry over that exempt use status. That's my guess, but however,
and I
vary. Yeah.
And June, just to build off that and kind of tie into what Darren was saying earlier, I would just run that by the assessor too. Because I'm sure they have a process where they do that, right? They take something that may be public and become private, and then from there, do their magic.
Also, if there's a fire, if a building had burned down, I believe, and Noah could correct me, but I believe it's 15 years. So if it burned down 14 years ago, and somebody's paying taxes on just the lot, that's if you got 79E for say 5 years, then you'd be paying what you would pay for a vacant lot.
Yep.
Yes, it's 15 years. You're correct, Aaron.
And there's an example in my region where that happened as well. There was a fire at a business, and they used 79E as they were redeveloping, and it was a good economic development tool for them.
I will say, I believe, June, you had said that you could, the parking lot example. My understanding is 79E is mostly purpose was for revitalization of underutilized existing structures. The housing opportunity zone, I think, so I'm not sure parking lot would work under a traditional 79E. The housing opportunity zone is a little bit more flexible, just to draw a distinction there in terms of structures or property. Just wanted to draw that distinction. We have another question here from Ryan. Could a municipality overlay a housing opportunity zone over entire residential districts to incentivize HUD restricted ADU development by resident property owners?
Ooh, smart.
That's a really good question. Before June jumps in, because I have like a pet peeve on this, I'd just like to draw the distinction. New Hampshire only allows voluntary inclusionary zoning. So you couldn't force a developer to produce or restrict units to a certain affordability level. However, the way the housing opportunity zone language in 79E colon 4 has been crafted, you're basically essentially getting the relief you're getting from the housing opportunity zone, essentially an incentive, which then allows for that kind of HUD rent restriction. So yes, I do think, Ryan, to answer your question, a town or a city could certainly do what you're proposing.
Yeah, I think you could do that. I think there's some questions on how useful the incentive would be ultimately.
Mhm.
But I think it would, if it's a tool in your tool chest, like that's something you have.
Well, the one thing about it is very easy. It's just so
Yeah.
easy. Unlike many other incentives, it's just an application, and then the administrative body just makes a decision. It's easy peasy. And then of course you have a covenant. We should mention that you have to have a covenant for public benefit that is allowed to run 2 times the length of the incentive. Say you give 4 years, you could make the covenant run 8. Exeter just goes the same amount. If we give 4 years, we have that covenant in place for 4 years. But that just means basically, so whoever doesn't know, what that means though is if a person, for Tony example, if Tony decided tomorrow he's gonna, you know what, I'm done with this business, I'm gonna make it a consignment shop, and then he loses his incentive. So don't do that, Tony. You have a James Beard semifinalist chef. So
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I did have a question. I know we're getting close to the hour. I think this is probably for Darren, and Matt, feel free to chime in as well. Can you talk about we talked about a little bit more about the domino effect that an initial 79E project can have on kind of the overall economic vitality and kind of opening up other redevelopment opportunities in the downtown or village center?
well, that's why I mentioned the CDOT before. It's a perfect one because we weren't seeing a lot of investment, frankly. Certainly not a lot of commercial, call it higher end commercial development in our downtown. And I think we all know how gorgeous our downtown is. But once the CDOT happened, then Thirsty Moose came in hot on their tail. Street came in, Tony came in. Otto came in right in our downtown. All these people just started making investments, and it completely changed. It was over the course of about, oh God, I'd say probably 6 years. It's just I don't have a vacant anything. I have several businesses that I want to bring in town that have interest, and I have nowhere to put them. And that's it. I say it's a direct, domino effect from the CDOG and from the 79E that they were able to get.
Yeah, I think I agree with that too. I mean, in the end, you think of your own downtown areas in your own community. You've got an area of town or a property that's kind of like a center of gravity. And if you can get that, redeveloped, or it has like a domino effect where it just motivates people to come in, and it's one of those unmeasurable things that you can't quantify, but you see it happening. And that's for Allentown how, China Mill is. It's kind of like a pull in that part of town. And once they open it up, it should really change things down there and have a positive impact.
I think from, even for purely housing projects too, there can be the same effect where we all know that like retail, and especially non-experiential like retail, is suffering and requires a lot more foot traffic and folks around to make a business work that used to work maybe 15 years ago. So housing development can provide that increased presence to make an existing business district work. So 79E can play that role even when it's doing purely housing stuff. Recognizing that it's one, I want to thank all of the panelists for their input today, all of the audience for showing up and sticking with us. We are almost at the end of our June Toolbox Fest. Next Thursday is our last webinar training specifically out of the toolbox. So BEA does their thing generally. But so June 29th, noon, we're talking form-based codes. So you can, like this, register at nhhousingtoolbox.org/training. And while we're still here, one last question from Stephanie. How has the town adjusted its parking to accommodate the increased foot traffic?
In Exeter, we haven't. We just what people think. I'm gonna channel our town planner who says this really well, who put together a really nice map of all the actual public parking that we do have. So like 15 years ago, you could park right in front of the business you want to walk into. Then like 10 years ago, you could park 2 spaces down. And now it's you're walking. You know, we're not Portsmouth, you're walking, but you're walking. And so we have a lot of side streets that have parking that just for years and years and years, nobody ever used it because A, they didn't know it was there, and B, they didn't need to. But now we need to. So
yeah, I think one thing I'd add, Darren, because we see it, is that it's a more efficient use of the parking we do have. So whereas spots may be completely full during the day, after 5 o'clock, you could roll a bowling ball down the street and not hit anything. And so now with businesses like ours and Sea Dog, and as you mentioned, Otto Pizza and a few other restaurants, we're now using those spots more hours of the day and more efficiently.
And in our case, the plan is to go ahead and put in paid parking. So I think we're going to be doing that this year. Those will help us obviously with the flow, and yeah, that's our plan.
Well, thanks again, you all, on that tidbit. I guess we'll close it out. See you all next week.
Thanks
everyone.